Hello, I'm your everyday average Jonathan. Join me this week as I turn this and this into these. Hello, I am your everyday average Jonathan. I'm an ordinary guy with ordinary tools making extraordinary things. I'm a self-taught craftsman. I am an amateur blacksmith and a novice woodworker. I have no professional training. I have a basic set of tools that I've cobbled together over the years. Each week I take you on a new build project for me. I show you my process. I show you my perspective. I don't edit out my aha moments. I don't edit out my mistakes. My goal is to demonstrate that anyone with a basic set of tools, a lot of hard-won knowledge, a lot of curiosity, and a lot of mistakes can craft things that might have seemed otherwise out of reach or too fantastical or too difficult even. The items that I make each week tend to be whimsical in nature, fantastical, echoing times of a forgotten yore, if you will. Items like weapons and armor, implements and tools, novelties, structures that I use on my ranch here in Colorado. This week I'm very excited. I received a commission to build what is called Sabatons. Sabatons are essentially medieval foot armor. It's a covering that goes over the top of the foot and it looks kind of like a lobster tail. It's articulated. Normally when I'm building things, I would build them in my own style and my own way of expressing, but this particular commission, the gal who commissioned this was very specific. She asked that I build her the foot armor for the Witch King in the Lord of the Rings, the leader of the Black Riders or the Nazgul. It's going to be a really interesting build. It's very stylized. It's going to be difficult, but I'm really looking forward to it. So without further ado, let's get to the shop and get started. All right, firstly, to begin this project, I thought that it was probably in my best interest to go to the mecca of all armor and weapons medieval in the United States, and that is the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York City. So I took myself to New York City to the Met, to their armor exhibition. It was like entering the Valhalla of all armor exhibitions. Certainly the biggest and best in the United States, and probably one of the top 5 in the entire world. If you're in New York City and you are interested in weapons and armor, you have to go to the Met and see their display. After taking somewhere around 72 hours to tour the place and get it all in, I took some pictures, continued to do a little bit of research, and here are the really cool things that I learned about foot armor. First off, the word sabaton, which is the word for the portion of armor that goes over the foot, has some very, very deep roots. It's either Old English or Old French or somewhere in between, and it's something along the lines of sabbat, and a sabbat or a sabbat was going way back, probably into the Dark Ages, maybe even earlier, was a wooden shoe. It was forgive my prop, it is the only prop that I'm going to use, but it was a shoe carved out of wood, much like the Scandinavian clogs that we've all seen and heard of. It was a shoe that was used for peasants and serfs of the time. Interestingly enough, sabaton or sabat also has a close relation to the word zapato, which is the Spanish word for shoe. Also interesting, we've all seen those little loaves of bread at the grocery store or on certain sandwich menus called ciabatta loaves. Ciabatta means slipper in Italian, and that is also related to sabaton because that little loaf kind of looks like a slipper if you ask me. Going further down the rabbit hole, there are modern tanks that shoot a round, an ammunition called the sabot round. Also rail guns shoot something called a sabot round, and essentially what a sabot round is it's just a metal projectile that's encased with some form of jacketing that acts as the fixture that is propelled out of the barrel. Then that metal portion on the inside, the casing comes off and the metal projectile continues to fly. Some of the earlier definitions and etymology of sabaton were not just the words for shoe, but also were the words for enclosure or something that was enclosed. As you will notice when you see these images and you see the final product, the foot armor that you'll see has these segments of metal that overlap and go up the shoe. These are actually called lames, and they're very common in a lot of plate armor, so much so, going back 2,000 years, the armor that Roman legionnaires wore was something called lorica segmentata, segmented armor. Each one of these pieces that you see here, that's a segment. It overlaps and it articulates. It moves with the armor, it moves with the motion that you want in the way that you want it to go. Each piece, as I said right here, they're called lames. Same thing is true with the foot. The overlapping pieces will overlap, they'll segment so that the foot can flex like this, One of the coolest things that I found out though while I was at the Met was that many historical pieces of Sabatons have this spiky point that goes off of the toe. I've known about those for a very long time, and I've always thought, well, how do you run? How do you walk? How do you move? How do you maneuver in a fight? Those weren't made for foot soldiers, I found out. Those are made for cavalry soldiers. They were made because if you are a mounted knight with full body armor and you're on a horse, where is your foot in relation to the people that you're going to be fighting? It's going to be at their head level or right at the level where they're going to be swinging their weapons. So having foot armor was an amazingly good idea. Having a spike on that just further enhanced the don't touch me aspect of your armor. I found out that most armored combatants who would be on their feet didn't wear Sabatons. They wore regular boots. All right, this takes me to the commission that I received. And the commission that I received was to make the Sabatons of none other than the Witch King of Angmar, which is a Lord of the Rings character from J.R.R. Tolkien's epic novels. I've already delved into the Lord of the Rings in some of my builds, and here's a link to the video where I make the dagger that the Witch King uses to stab the character Frodo. We won't get into that. You can watch that video to your heart's content. Please do. But in the Lord of the Rings, for those of you that don't know the story, the Dark Ruler in this particular world, it's called Middle-earth, the Dark Ruler, whose name is Sauron, has armies that do his bidding, but he also has essentially special forces that do his bidding, and there are 9 of them, and they're called the Nazgul, or the Ring Wraiths, or the Dark Riders. Those 9 are led by one who is called the Witch King. They are long undead human kings of yore that were corrupted by the Dark Lord to do his bidding well past the grave. So the lady who commissioned me has the suit of armor and the helmet and the sword and now the gauntlets that were in the movies of the Lord of the Rings. She's put together the full outfit. She doesn't have the Sabaton, so she approached me to do that. Here's the great part. When she came to me and asked me to make this commission, here's the image that she sent me and said, "Can you make these?" I'm being a little bit silly. That is the image she first sent me, but she also sent me a few other images which are copyrighted. I can't show them to you here, but I was able to reverse engineer, if you will. I think I did a decent job of reverse engineering what I saw in those images to her size. I met her on a dark mountain crossroads, took measurements of her feet, and off we go. One of the very first things that my client asked me to do was to make these light. I let her know that the armor that I tend to make tends to be heavier. The gauge of metal that I use for my armor making is almost always 14 gauge and sometimes down as far as 11 gauge, which is about 1/8 of an inch. That gets very thick and very heavy, but she asked me and very politely to not make it heavy. So I chose 20 gauge metal for this. It was difficult for me to make that choice because it is the absolute lightest gauge of metal I think I've ever worked with. It felt like I was making 1930s toy trains out of it, but you got to do what the customer asks. And I did find out that when you make armor out of these lighter gauges, that sometimes you can just bend things with your hands. I was surprised by how easy it was to manipulate these pieces of metal, both with a hammer and just with a gloved hand. This also marks one of the few times that I've ever been able to use a pair of what I would call tin snips to cut out the forms in the armor. I've done that once before, but typically anything 16 gauge and below starts to get to a point where using tin snips for me and my grip strength doesn't quite work so well. I have an admission to make. I had said earlier in the intro that I had taken myself to New York to the Met to do some research. I was actually already there for business, so I just made it the extra trip. I'd already been to the Met Army Museum before, but I took my brother this time, and it was awesome. Now what I'm doing is, I do this on most of my armor. I like the distressed look. What I do is I will hammer one side of it pretty thoroughly, and then the opposite side, the side that I don't hammer, will have that textured look on the other side, but it won't show the more obvious hammer marks, but it does have some texture, some definition to it. It just makes it look old. It makes it look used. It makes it look battle worn. I really like that look. It does require quite a bit of elbow grease, a lot of hammering, but that's what it takes. I don't know where I learned this from, but this is the way that I make creases. I have several chisels that are large format, and I just go ahead and hammer on both sides of that chisel, not hard enough that it's going to separate the metal, but it does make my creases, and it does a pretty good job. Now I'm using my swage block to start making the rounded portions as this lame. These are called lames. Each portion here is called a lame as they overlap the foot. Here's something I find really curious and really interesting. Most of the manufacture of medieval armor came from 2 locations, essentially. One is northern Italy, Milan, and the other is southern Germany, Nuremberg, where there were some very famous armories. That said, almost all of the parts of the armor carry French names. everything from gauntlet to helmet to cuirass. I don't know why that is. Even the very Germanic designed medieval helmet carries a French name called the Sallet. Again, I've looked into it periodically and I have never found out the answer as to why that is. This is the form of the portion that's going to go over the front of the foot, the toe, and it's going to have a little spike, which is really fascinating to me. I looked at this from so many angles and thought, well, how does somebody walk with those particular spikes sticking out? How does somebody not catch them and trip? How would an armored combatant maneuver when they're in combat with these particular spikes? And here you see me distressing it again. I use multiple different types of hammer strikes and different edges of the hammer. This is a really cool hammer. I don't even know what it is, but somebody just gave it to me. And it's just the coolest hammer ever, so I enjoy using that as part of my distressed arsenal. And every time I do this and I watch what I'm doing with that swage block, it always makes me kind of pucker as my fingers just feel like they're moments away from being smashed. So far, so good, though. And here I'm shaping that spiked point, and this has got some compound curves to it. So using the swage block is kind of the only way I could accomplish that. Compound curve is an intersection of two curves that might be, I don't want to say opposing, but aren't going the same direction. And you can have compound curves with big creases in them, which make it much more difficult to accomplish. On this particular one with that swage block and the metal being so thin, it wasn't too bad. I never really put a whole lot of thought into how useful the swage block is in armor making especially, but once I'm starting to make these forms, I realized that I use that swage block all the time, and if I didn't have it, I've only had it for probably maybe 2 years, maybe less, and if I didn't have it, a lot of this would be done on the anvil. Totally possible, as I'm doing here, but just I'm not good enough and I'm not experienced enough to not use something like that swage block to kind of, I don't want to say cheat, but fast forward to the forms and the shapes that I'm looking to make. I'm really proud of that little ball that you just saw there. I made that. There was a lot of welding and grinding that went into that ball, but I use it all the time. It's a great little tool that I can insert into the swage block or into the anvil or into a vise. Now I'm going ahead and drilling the holes that I'm going to use to rivet the different lames when they overlap and rivet them together so they move. And this is why you wear gloves. I don't always wear gloves when I'm using the drill, but I'm telling you, it saves my bacon. And I'm sure I'm not the only one that does this, but anytime I want to widen a hole after I've drilled it, just kind of rocking it back and forth on that particular drill bit, probably not ideal, but it certainly works. Also, I'm certain that I'm not the only person to do this, but no one ever showed this to me where I'm using little bolts to put in place of those rivets just to get things sized up. I'm pretty certain everyone does that, probably going back to ancient times. Just kidding, because I don't think they actually had bolts. But it is a great way to get things lined up before you rivet it and make sure everything fits and functions the way that you want it to. I asked my client to come by and let me do I would say a halfway mark fitting on her. These are the very boots that she's going to wear, and so far it looks pretty good. I'm pleased with how it fits. I don't think you're gonna eat it. I really don't. You're gonna walk duck with like this. I really don't.
No, but like the best part of the costume is to have like the intimidation.
Yet the question definitely remains, is she gonna catch a toe? Is she gonna trip? I don't think so, as long as she's not planning on doing any balletic moves. Now here's an interesting thing that happened to me. I was trying to make a piece that went up the front of the foot there, and that is a compound curve that I was trying to create, and I utterly failed in this. I actually ended up giving it up because I just could not get that compound curve to work, which really sucks because it would have looked really cool had I been able to do that. A better armor maker 100% wouldn't have been able to do that. And here they are. I put some leather straps on the back and underneath. The ones that are going to go underneath are just leather cords. They're going to be there just to kind of like placeholders while I fit it up, and then once I'm done, I'll do something that is more permanent. But they came out good. I think they do look like the images of the Nazgul Sabatons that she sent me. I'm pleased with that. Unfortunately, my client was out of town for the week that I was finishing these up, and I wanted to get this video done, so I wasn't able to show them on her feet. I will probably post a follow-up video at some point with that, but here they are in all their glory. Well, thank you for joining me for that. That was really fun, really interesting, and really educational. Okay, straight in. The takeaways that I have from that build are not actually that many. The first one that I can think of is this, that I need to find something that can deburr and take the jagged edges off of thinner sheet metal than I'm normally working with. That gauge of sheet metal, which I believe is 20 gauge, I've deburred that thing and wire wheeled that thing and used that reaming tool, and it still is pretty jagged, honestly. Those edges are, I'm not in love with how jagged those edges are. The second learning that I have is a design learning, and that is something that now is really obvious, but I feel like I should have spotted it and I didn't, and that is the overlapping articulations, those pieces of metal that are called lames, as you come up the foot from the toe. For them to have the right girth or the right dimensions to overlap and go all the way over the foot, they're going to need to be a little bit larger. The further up from the toe they get, they're going to need to have a little bit more length on them so that they cover the full amount of foot. I didn't get that right. It still looks good. It still looks like what I saw, but going forward, I will probably make these again and I'll make that adjustment. And then really, I think the only other learning is the spikes on the end of the toes, that those are meant for mounted combatants. I'll probably have to redesign how I do those spikes on those toes so that you can kind of come up on them, maybe make them articulated. Actually, that makes me think of an idea. I think that's what I'll probably end up doing. There is something else that I just realized that I learned, and that is that compound curves for me in armor making in metal just remain extremely difficult. A compound curve is when you have an item that has two intersecting curves. So you can have a curve this direction, and then it's also going to curve that direction at the same time, especially when there's creases involved, when there's hard corners involved within those curves. I completely failed that with this particular one. I've done it before and it was a big process. I'm surprised I failed at this one, but admittedly I did. Well, that's it for me. Thank you for joining me for that build. I hope that you enjoyed it. Next week, I will be making something that for some reason I'm ridiculously excited to make. I'm gonna be making a rustic, medieval, gothic, maybe even brutish torch. You know those things that you hold with the wooden handle and it's got the fire on the top of it, that little round of material on the top that's on fire? I'm gonna be making one of those, but as in everything, it's gonna be my own style, and I've already got a pretty good picture of what I wanna do. I hope that you join me for that. Until then, God bless, be well.